So there are these two qualitatively different ways of being in the world, or of living our lives. One which is living on the basis of thought, which is straightforward to explain, and the other is living on the basis of consciousness. Only we shouldn't really say basis, because it implies a basis, which is to say some kind of fixed baseline or yardstick to which everything can be compared. And this isn't true for consciousness. It's true for thinking. So thinking always works by comparing everything to a baseline or to a standard. The very action of thinking involves comparing everything to our set of classificatory constructs or categories. And if anything doesn't or can't be compared to a yardstick in this way, it doesn't figure, it isn't real, it isn't anything. So although there's lots of stuff that can't make sense in terms of the yardstick of the thinking mind, it's not stuff that we encounter very much, because the only way we encounter the world is via the agency of thought. This is like the official news channel. And of course we might say that, like all official news channels, the information that it provides us with is bent to suit a particular purpose, and it leaves out an awful lot. So this is the official narrative, which is the news channel of the thinking mind, which can be relied on in some areas, but for anything important or anything more global, it can't be relied on. So it might, on the face of it, seem like a strange thing how we can have consciousness and how consciousness can work by not comparing anything to anything, which is another way of saying that consciousness is non-dual in the lingo. So how this works, we can perhaps try to explain by talking about eating. Now, in one way, when we do eat food, we do compare it to our memory. So if I taste something and it's an orange, it'll remind me of all the other times that I've eaten oranges, and I'll compare it with my memory of eating oranges, and I'll know that I'm actually eating an orange, even if I'm blindfolded. So in this way, taste does operate according to standards, but not in the same way that thought does, because thought has to operate in relation to standards. It absolutely couldn't get anywhere otherwise without referring to the book. If thought can't refer to the book, it's lost. What's it going to say? It can't say anything. It's lost in space. And thought's no good when it's lost in space. It has to be tied to these concrete categories the whole time, and then it has to refer everything back to these concrete categories and make concrete statements. But taste isn't quite like this. Taste can actually function without relating the information that we've received to a memory. And this is just as well, because otherwise every time we ate something, it would turn into a memory straight away, which would be a bit tiresome. Which is probably something, or almost certainly, definitely is something that can happen anyway, that we can eat and taste things automatically in this way. But we know that if we take the time and engage wholeheartedly in this process of eating and tasting, straight away there is this odd kind of doubleness, we could call it. So if I'm tasting an orange, I know it's an orange, there's no big shock there. But if I really am just tasting and wholeheartedly engaging in this tasting, it's also new. And that's where the enjoyment comes from, the fact that it is new and as if I had never tasted it before. Second-hand flavours or rumours of flavours really don't cut the mustard. So the vividness and the feeling that this is not something that is created merely by comparing to our ideas about the world is very dramatic. And we have this experience of actually tasting something for the first time, even if it's something that we eat every day. So in this case, what we could say is that there is a perception that we're having that is a completely non-comparative perception. And we can test this for ourselves very easily. Anything at all, anything with flavour, we can notice that to be able to perceive that flavour is not dependent on anything else. And that the more I attend to the flavour, the less historical its quality becomes. So I'm tasting an orange and there's no history of oranges or my past experiences with oranges. The immediacy of the flavour cuts right through that. So this is pretty much like the Buddhist idea of suchness. Suchness being a quality or character, if we could call it that stands alone. So when we're experiencing it, we know very well that we are experiencing it. It's vivid, it's very clear, very strong, very remarkable because it's a unique occurrence, not a regular occurrence. It's not a repetition of something that happened before. So this unique vividness, if we attend to it, we realize that we're attending to reality. And that reality is a non-comparative phenomenon. Or in other words, it's always new and unprecedented. So this Buddhist idea of suchness basically means it tastes like what it tastes. And that's what it tastes like. And to say that it tastes like it tastes isn't a comparison, because we can't compare something with itself, because that doesn't tell us anything. But it just sounds like a comparison. In reality, it's a standalone. It just is what it is. But beyond that, we can say nothing, because beyond that, we would have to go looking for other things to compare it with, which is what we do when we talk. We compare things to other things. It's like when we write essays. If we're a student, you always have to compare everything with such and such a person said this, or such and such another person said that, or the research said this. It's all comparative. And the result of that is none of it's new. And that's the activity of the thinking mind in a nutshell. But all of that's very tedious. As Schumacher said somewhere, The known isn't interesting because we know it. It's not ever going to change. It's just always the known. So the world of comparative meanings is a dead world. This is the state of psychostasis. It's a dead world in which nothing ever changes. Because that's the whole point of comparisons. If I compare something to my inner yardstick, that inner yardstick's always going to be the same, because it wouldn't be much of an yardstick if it changed and mutated every time. It has to be the same. That's absolutely crucial that it stays the same. So we can see right there is the root of psychostasis, which is imposing a fixed or unchanging format upon the world, in which the only meanings are comparative meanings. So I know I keep coming back to talking about living on the basis of thought because it's easier to talk about. It's actually the only thing I can talk about, really. Living on the basis of consciousness, therefore, is kind of like living on the basis of unique flavors, if we can call it that. So everything's kind of like a unique standalone flavor that doesn't form part of a system. It can't form part of a logical system because logical systems are logical systems because there is an underlying consistency to them. This can be compared to this, which can be compared to that, or this can be inferred from such and such, which can be inferred from such and such something else. So there's always the thread of continuity, which means that every bit can be compared to every other bit and expressed as a kind of like a ratio. So you could say that everything's a ratio of everything else, which is a good way of talking about the world, which is created by the rational mind, or the rational mind. So it's ontologically unchallenging, the world that's created by the rational mind. Because once we get the hang of one little bit of it, we've got the hang of all of it. Because it all obeys the same rules. So what we can say then is that living on the basis of thought is ontologically or existentially unchallenging, which represents a type of the psychological advantage in inverted commas, because it's a kind of advantage which looks like an advantage but very quickly turns into a huge drawback or huge limitation. In other words, we obtain the sense of familiarity and that sense of being one step ahead of things, or having a kind of an angle which can enable us to progress. We obtain that at a cost, and the cost is we get to become blind about everything that doesn't relate to the yardstick of the thinking mind. So, in other words, the cost is that we create inadvertently, without knowing it, a blind spot. So then the question is, how big is this blind spot? Is it a medium-sized one, a small one, or quite a big one, or a very big one? And the answer is that the blind spot is everything that the thinking mind can't make sense of in terms of its unchanging yardstick. And yet everything that the thinking mind can make sense of in terms of its unchanging yardstick is only itself, is only its own framework that's been projected on the world and used to feed back information, which means that the world that does make sense in terms of the thinking mind is only the thinking mind's own models reflected outwards. And so there isn't actually any space for reality in that. Here's the model on the one side, and that gets reflected back again, which because it's the model being reflected back again still is the model. So there's nothing that isn't the model, and the model isn't reality. The model is only a model, and nothing the mind comes up with can ever be anything else than a model, because that's the thinking mind's job, to make descriptions or models or guesses, as Robert Anton Wilson says. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Ultimately, all these guesses prove wrong, but in the short term, in a narrow enough field, they can be fruitful. And that's how the mind works and is adaptive within its specific range. So the blind spot, which is created by only believing in the thinking mind and not listening to any other sources of information, is as big as reality. It is reality. Our blind spot is reality. So that's how big our blind spot is. So there is the price we have to pay for creating or engineering a world with this logical consistency to it that we're happy to have, because it allows us to cling on to a consistent sense of ourselves, a continuum of self that's the same from minute to minute to minute, second to second, moment to moment. It's an unbroken line, and it's an unbroken line that shoots off and seems to be getting somewhere, but isn't, even though, like all lines, it shoots off to infinity. So on the x-axis, it shoots off to positive infinity on one side, negative infinity on the other, which seems pretty dynamic. But what we don't focus on is the fact that that straight line is only a projection of a single defined point, projected over and over and over again. So you could say that the line is nothing more than an infinite number of those same points. There's nothing new on in linear change. There's nothing new on a straight line. It's the same thing over and over again. So if there is an infinity there, which in a way there is, it's an infinity of the same. It's like watching a repeat. So it's producing for us what we could call a false type of spaciousness. The thinking mind produces a virtual reality which has a false type of spaciousness in it. But really that spaciousness is a tautology. If we were to look at it, we'd realize it's all a redundancy, and it all collapses into this one point, which is actually an abstraction because there aren't any defined points in reality. Defined points are what we project on reality, which is the same as saying that a defined point is really the same as a framework, which is made up of lots of defined points, which we impose on reality in order to obtain logical consistency. So when we live on the basis of consciousness, initially there is this big drawback, which is the existential challenge. And the existential challenge is that everything is standalone, a once-off, unprecedented, unique, and nothing can be compared to anything else. So we don't have an angle that we can use. I can't have a theory of life or a theory of stuff. I can't have a model. I can't have an idea, because an idea only works with irregularities if it can be applied across the board with different events, different situations arising. An idea wouldn't be an idea if it was only applicable in one unique instance and nothing else, which is just the same as saying that a class or a category could not be a class or a category if it can only be used for the one unique, never to be repeated phenomenon. You wouldn't need a class or a category then. It would be stupid to talk in terms of such a thing. So the disadvantage, so to speak, is that we have no overview. Everything is immediate and intense and vivid and unique, and we can't make sense of it in the way that we are so used to making sense of it. Because we can't make sense of the new, because the only way to make sense, in inverted commas, of the new is to transform it into the old, which is what the thinking mind does. And consciousness does not transform the new into the old. Its way of functioning, if you could call it functioning, is to let the new be the new, and don't try and explain it away or process it in any way. And so, when we're living in this world of pure immediacy, of unique perceptions or suchness, what happens is there is no continuum or continuity of self. There's no continuity of anything, and so there can't be a self, because the self is a yardstick. Myself is my yardstick, so whatever situation I'm in, I measure it with my yardstick to see what it means to me, or to make sense of it, or to process it in some way. And as I was saying, the yardstick is the same all the time, so there is the consistency, and that is the consistency that is lacking when we're living on the basis of consciousness. So this way of living means that there is no thread of a continuous platform, which is me, because my perception is not anchored in that way. And so my perception of what's going on is not tethered to some static framework, but it is new moment by moment, just as the perceived reality is. So it's all newness, and there's no old self there, smuggling itself into the situation and trying to compare and understand the new in terms of itself or in terms of the old the whole time. So in this way, it's very challenging. Existentially speaking, it's ultimately challenging. But the plus side of it is that it also is real, whereas life, when it's lived on the basis of the thinking mind, however apparently spacious it may seem, is actually redundant. It's a collection of redundancies. It's an exercise in redundancy, which means it can be collapsed into a single point, a single defined point, which has been projected outwards over and over again. And this defined point isn't a real thing, it's an abstraction. It's just a platform that we are assuming in order to make sense of everything else. So, although living on the basis of the thinking mind is safe in inverted commas, or gives us a sense of security, the downside is that it is infinitely redundant. Okay, thanks for watching.